I'm Kimberly Austin. Welcome to Rock Book Show. Joining me today is author Caryn Rose. She's written her first novel. Congratulations, Caryn.
Thank you very much.
It's called B-Sides and Broken Hearts. Love the title. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But first, let's just talk about the genesis of the book. How did you come to write this book?
It was the book I always wanted to write. I tried for years to write a book, and I have lots of journals with stories in them that never got finished. And then I started reading Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones, and I started going and doing writing every weekend. I would just sit, I would do exercises, and one night I went to bed. I dreamed of the first chapter. I got up in the morning, I sat down, I wrote the first chapter start to finish. It's pretty much unchanged. The only thing I didn't have was the title. And once I had the title, the rest of the book came out. It was for years I would always go and this is a book about a music fan, this is a book about rock and roll. And I was always disappointed. Either they got facts wrong, way too wrong. I got a fact wrong in the book. I will cop to that. They got facts wrong, and the women were always, they were groupies, they were girlfriends, they were always on the side, and that wasn't my experience. And I really I say in my book trailer, I wrote the book I always wanted to read. That's how the book started.
That's cool, and it is a wonderful read. So give us a little synopsis of what the book is about.
The book is about what happens to a woman, Lisa Simon. She's 37. The blurb on the book says she's 37 and still loves loud punk rock, but hates Dave Matthews with an all-biting passion. And that really does sum up Lisa Simon. And it's about one of those moments that you have in your life, one of those, you've been going along, everything's been fine, and then something makes you stop and take stock of everything, and you can either keep going or you can decide to change things. And Lisa decided to change things, and she gets in her car and she starts driving to Los Angeles. And the book is the drive, and it's what she thinks about in the drive, which is her entire life up until that point. And then the end of the story is what happens when she gets to LA and the resolution she does or doesn't find there.
Yeah, it's quite a road trip, and I love all the selection of music that goes into the road trip. That's wonderful. But I want to go back to something you touched on. What was the original title of the book?
The original title of the book was Joey Ramone is Dead. It's the first line of the book. It's what happened when Joey Ramone. That's the event for her. It was Joey Ramone died, and I would have loved that to be the original to be the title of the book. But attorneys said it would probably not be. It might have been a problem, and it could have been an expensive problem. So, and I was tortured because it had that title for 10 years, but I sat down and started writing a list of titles, and it came out right away. It came out so quickly that I was sure that somebody had already used it. So I spent a lot of time researching it, but no one's ever used it, which is astonishing to me because it's a great song title, it'll be a great album title. But I got it.
Nice. And what's your favorite B-side?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I could quote Mike Mills, there aren't any B-sides anymore, there are MP3s. I guess my favorite B-side is probably the live version. It's Elton John and John Lennon doing I Saw Her Standing There live from Madison Square Garden, which is the B-side of Philadelphia Freedom.
Wow, good choice.
And not many people probably know that, but that was, I played that side more than I played the other side.
Well, you have a really cool musical history, not only as a fan, but as a writer. Tell us more about you.
Well, I started out, I always wanted to be in the music business. I wanted to start the next Rolling Stone. That was what I wanted to do back when I was in college. In college, I was the arts editor of the paper. I wrote about music. I got out of college. I couldn't find anyone to take my writing. I was photographing bands. I was doing PR for bands. I even managed a band for a little while. I got a job with a professional manager. Then I got a job as a label manager at the former Warner Elektra Atlantic. I was a label manager for WEA. I stopped doing that and got into computers. And that's how I ended up in Seattle in 1995, right when everything was happening. So it's funny that we're doing this during the Pearl Jam 20 weekend. And when I finally wrote Joey Ramone is Dead, my first instinct was, I'm just going to put this out myself because that's what you do. You don't wait for permission, you just do it. But everyone said, no, don't do that to yourself. Because at the time, the only people who were putting out books themselves were people writing books about Area 51. So I did the big publishing thing. I queried agents. It was, and I'm not sorry I went through that process because I know how to do it. I queried 147 agents. And then I ended up with, 5 agents offering me representation, made a choice and said, okay, now we're just going to wait for you to sell the book. And we waited. And we waited. And we waited. And 6 years later and 2 other manuscripts later, I decided that I didn't really care about the stigma anymore, but I did care about the fact that this book should have been out 4 years ago or 5 years ago, and it wasn't. And I could have looked for another agent and then waited another 3 years for it to come out, or I could just put it out. And I put it out.
Yeah, I'm so glad you did. As you're telling your story, I couldn't help but think that there are a lot of characteristics of you in your main character, Lisa Simon. So would you say this is semi-autobiographical?
I would like to think that I've made better life choices than Lisa Simon did. Unlike Lisa, I make decisions really quickly, and I'm not afraid to make a decision, where I feel like Lisa sort of like lives her life in an eternal waffle. She's afraid. She just doesn't question anything. Whereas I'm constantly I question everything. I question what I'm making for dinner. So, and also Lisa's a Stones fan. I'm doing a playlist for Large Hearted Boy. I'm doing a book notes, and I write about the role of the Stones in the book because I very deliberately picked when you were growing up if you were growing up in the tri-state area in the 70s or the 80s, you were a Who person, you were a Zepp person, you were a Stones person. You might have been, nobody was a Beatles person. You might have been like a Floyd, stoner music person, but those were like you aligned yourself along one of those lines. I remember when WNEW over like Labor Day weekend did the top 100 rock songs of all time for the first time, and number 2 was Bob O'Reilly, and number 1 was Stairway to Heaven. And the phones apparently just lit up, and I remember Dennis Elsis going, "Where were you Who people when we were voting?"
It was always Stairway to Heaven where I grew up, always.
It was always Stairway to Heaven. It was not even the Stones. The Stones didn't even come in there. So, yes, there are things in there that I have done in my life, but not exactly in that way. I remember when one of my first readers read the book, and she handed the manuscript back to me and said, "I didn't know you got into a car crash on the way back from the Clash in Asbury Park." And I said, "I didn't." And she's like, that was her first like, oh shit, everything I say can be book fodder someday, god damn it, moment. And she didn't I remember hearing that story from her, and I for years, and I love that story. I'm like, that story has to go in the book.
But there's another story in the book that I love about a teenage Lisa whose boyfriend is such a douche. She doesn't get her tickets for the Who concert at Madison Square Garden. She has to go. So she scams her mom and takes her money and gets on the bus, comes in by herself to the city, which many kids from Jersey have done. And I'm wondering, Lisa, I am wondering, Caryn, have you done that?
I definitely did my share of sneaking into the city. I did not get to see the Who at Madison Square Garden. I wanted to very badly, but that was so advanced sneaking even for me. And Dad, since you're going to watch this, now you have your answer. I didn't just take people and change the names to fictionalize it. It is a complete fictional, it is a story. It is a world I built. I like fiction. Everybody wants it to be real. Everybody wants to think they know who the people are. I get emails like, did you really grow up in Jersey? No, I was born in Jersey, but I didn't grow up in Jersey, but I grew up in Connecticut. Is it that difference? It's like there's this old adage about writing that if you take a potato chip rack from a bar in Rochester and put it in a bar in the Bowery, it's this, you're just giving a detail. It doesn't matter where it is. And that's the fact that so many people think it's real or want it to be real just means I did a really good job in telling a story.
You did a great job in telling a story. I was thinking the exact same thing as you were saying that. But speaking of your dad, what's it like when you write a sex scene in a book your dad might read?
Yeah, I didn't really think about that until I was reading the book. I had some readings and I had to pick some scenes to read. So I sort of started skimming through the book, and I was like, oh, yeah. It was a little odd when my dad was like, can I give it to the rabbi? The rabbi would be very interested to know that you wrote a book. And I'm like, I'm not sure I can give this to the rabbi. And he's like, well, I think you handled things very tastefully. And I was like, oh, God, please cut this conversation off right now. I am not having this conversation with my father.
It was a classy scene. It didn't go penthouse letter forum action. It was very tastefully done, Caryn.
Thank you. That's all. Susie Bright has a book called How to Write a Sex Scene. I owe it all to her.
I wondered where you got your inspiration. Does it take a couple glasses of wine, or?
It didn't, and there were some other sex scenes in there that were not nearly as good, and some early readers may remember them, but that's why you edit.
Well, how about Blue Electric, the band? Are they based on anybody?
They are based on everybody. They're based on everybody. It's not one band. Everyone thinks they know who they are. There's little bits and pieces of everybody I've ever known, whether they were musicians or not. But I didn't live next door to a band, and they didn't become, one of the most famous bands in the world. That's where I'm like, this is the story. Because if I did, I would have already had them endorsing my book and saying, Blue Electric or us. No, I mean, I guess I could have been cutesy about it if I was a smarter marketer and said, guess who Blue Electric is? But that's a little too James Fry for me.
So who are some of your favorite bands and musicians?
I am a Stones fan, but not quite like they are. You grew up. When you grew up, I picked The Who. The Who were my band for a very long time. I love Patti Smith. I love The Clash. I love the Ramones. I love the Ramones. I love the Ramones when loving the Ramones got you shoved into a locker in high school. Those are sort of the core. I love Bruce Springsteen. I'm one of those crazy Bruce. I am a crazy Bruce Springsteen person. Although there are people still crazier than me. There's always somebody crazier than me. New bands. Marat, whose feet are on the cover of the book. I was a big Marat fan. I am a big fan of Dave Belanco and Serge Belanco. Patti Smith, I spent 2 years ago, going to every single performance she did in the New York area because she does a lot of really interesting things. She does things at museums, she does reading, she does all these different things, and I decided that one of the reasons I came back to New York was so that I didn't miss out on things like that. And if something happened to Patti, I didn't want to say, oh God, I had all these chances to see her and I didn't see her. I've seen everything. I spent that year going to lectures at the Morgan. It was crazy, but it was great. And she's incredibly inspirational, and she really just talks about all the time about working hard. And I think that's an important, that's how you get somewhere, is you work hard. And she doesn't make any bones about the fact that it wasn't magic. She worked hard.
And let us not forget, you are in this amazing documentary called Color Me Obsessed about the Replacements. How'd you end up in that?
So this is a funny story. The first book that Gorman Bechard wrote, The Second Greatest Story Ever Told, is one of my favorite books of all time. I found out about it. I was reading a Replacements website like 2 a.m. I was just reading stuff about the Replacements because I missed the Replacements, and they had a page where they listed everywhere the Replacements had been mentioned in books. And I read, and this is a story about what happens if God decided to send his daughter down this time, and she's a Replacements fan. I'm like, that sounds interesting. I looked for the book. It was out of print. I had to order it used. I got it. I loved it. I would buy copies for people because I loved it so much. I said, when I sell my first book and I have money, I'm going to buy the film rights to this because this is such an amazing story. I love this story. And we just sort of stayed in touch on and off over the years. And I saw he was doing this documentary on the Replacements. And I said, I've got a story for you. And the story actually didn't end up in the movie because it was too convoluted. Part of the story did. The story about the guy who hired them to play a show, and Bob was playing pinball, and Jon Stewart was the bartender. It was at City Gardens in Trenton. The funny thing is, they confused. There were 2 shows at City Gardens. One was a show that was perfectly straight, and that's the show I remember. The other was the show which they were fucked up, and everybody was upset about. The dates got totally confused, and if the rest of the story had been in there, it would have gotten worked out. But like Gorman said, it's a potentially true story. My friend Jen, which is my story, is I had these friends who lived down on the Jersey Shore, lived in Ocean City and Deal, and they came up to the show. And they were in the car driving home listening to WPRB, and they heard everybody dissing the show, and then they heard the Replacements stop the van, call in and say, we're going to break up. And they were hysterical about the fact that they were hysterical. And it wasn't the Replacements were at Maxwell's. Somebody else was there, but the Replacements were playing Maxwell's, and they lied to their mom, got on the train, snuck up, came to Hoboken, and I picked them up because they didn't want to go to the show because they knew they couldn't get into the show, but they just wanted to talk to Paul or somebody and tell them that they thought it was a good show and that they shouldn't break up. And Paul was so sweet. He listened to them. He made everybody else go away. He made them sit down. He bought them dinner. When we had to get him back on a train, I called a cab. He went out, walked them to the cab, insisted on paying for the cab. He came back in and he goes, how will you know that they get home safe? Will they call you? I want to know they get home safe. they had told him they were playing a show in Philadelphia the next week at a university, and so Paul's like, okay, I'll put you on the list. And they had to like talk their sister into driving them to Philadelphia, and she drives them to Philadelphia, and they get there late, and she's like, you're not going to be on the list, but they were on the list, and they get in, and they push their way up to the front, and when they were talking with Paul, they told them that one of their big fantasies was that they would have, for their 16th birthday, that the Replacements would come and play in their basement. That is a pretty cool thing for a teenage girl in the 80s to like be thinking when everybody else is listening to the regular crap. And so they told him the story, and he just loved it. But they told me later that when they got there and they got up to the front, at one point he changed the set list and started playing 16 Blue, and he changed the lyrics to like, well, you know, on your 16th birthday we're going to play a show in your basement, like totally made up lyrics about them, just like such a like heartbreaking. Yeah, and these are not the stories that get told about the Replacements. I'm sorry that story didn't make it in the movie. I understand Dorman had to make a lot of choices. He had a lot of interviews. But yes, the Replacements, of course.
Oh man, but this just shows why your book is so great, because you have so many great stories like that have inspired you, that you've lived, that you've enjoyed, and it really, your book reads like a high fidelity for girls.
Which is exactly what I wanted to write. And Dave Belanco from Murad, Murad did a couple of like show reading kind of combos with Nick Hornby, and the first time I'm like, okay, I'm just going to go talk to Nick Hornby. I'm going to tell him I have this book. And then the next time, Dave's like, have you met Nick? I'm going to introduce you to Nick. Nick, she wrote this book. It's really good. And I'm like, yeah, I have an agent now. Now Nick's like, oh. And I said, I always said I wanted to write the women's version of High Fidelity. And Nick's like, well, you're welcome to that. So not really an endorsement from Nick Hornby, but it's the closest I'll get unless I get up the nerve to send it to him.
I think you should. The book is B-Sides and Broken Hearts. This is author Caryn Rose, all the way from Brooklyn, New York.